My sister was wearing my wedding dress, and her hand was resting on my fiancé's arm like she had always belonged there. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even ask a single question. I just stood there, watching them, and let the room fill with a silence so heavy it felt like it might crack the walls. That morning had started like any other day I had spent preparing for what I thought would be the happiest chapter of my life. At 67, I wasn't expecting fairy tales, but I believed in something quieter, something steadier. Daniel had come into my life 5 years after my husband passed, bringing with him a kind of calm I thought I had lost forever. He wasn't flashy or overly charming, but he was consistent, and at my age, consistency felt like love. Linda, my younger sister, had been by my side through all of it. Or at least, that's what I believed. She offered to help with everything. The invitations, the venue, even the dress. Especially the dress. I remember the afternoon we picked it up from the boutique downtown. How she ran her fingers over the fabric and smiled a little too long, a little too thoughtfully. I thought she was just happy for me. I thought she was proud. Looking back now, I realize how many small things I chose not to question. The way Daniel would pause before answering simple questions about the future. The way Linda suddenly started showing up unannounced, always when Daniel was around. The way conversations would stop the moment I entered the room, replaced by polite smiles and casual topics. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, what kind of woman suspects her own sister? What kind of bride doubts the man who asked her to spend the rest of his life with him? So I kept going. I finalized the guest list. I confirmed the caterer. I trusted Linda to keep my dress safe in her spare closet, saying it would be a surprise to see it again on the day that mattered. And I believed her. Until that afternoon. The small gathering at Linda's house was supposed to be a simple pre-wedding dinner. Just family, a few close friends, nothing extravagant. I remember standing on her front porch, smoothing down my coat, feeling a quiet kind of excitement settle in my chest. I thought I was walking into a celebration. Instead, I walked into something else entirely. The room fell silent when I stepped inside, and for a moment, I thought I had interrupted something innocent, something harmless. Then I saw her. The dress fit her perfectly, too perfectly, as if it had been chosen for her all along. Daniel stood beside her, his expression unreadable, his hand covering hers in a gesture that was far too familiar. No one moved. No one spoke. And in that stillness, everything became clear in a way words could never explain. I could have demanded answers. I could have made a scene, forced them to explain themselves in front of everyone. But something inside me shifted instead. Something quiet. Something cold. I realized in that moment that whatever they had taken from me, they believed they had already won. And that was their first mistake. I did not move. Not right away. I let the moment stretch, let every pair of eyes in that room settle on me as if they were waiting for something dramatic, something loud, something that would make them feel justified in what they were witnessing. But I gave them nothing. I simply took a slow breath, the kind that fills your chest and steadies your hands, and I stepped further into the room as if nothing was wrong. Linda smiled first, a bright, almost rehearsed expression, the kind she used when she wanted to control how a situation looked from the outside. Daniel followed a second later, his hand still resting over hers, though I noticed the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his shoulders lifted just enough to betray that he was not as comfortable as he wanted to appear. No one introduced what was happening. No one explained. It was as if they had all silently agreed that I would understand without words, that I would accept it quietly and make things easier for everyone. I had spent most of my life doing exactly that, keeping the peace, smoothing over discomfort, making sure everyone else felt at ease, even when it cost me something. I suppose that was why they thought I would do it again. I walked to the dining table and placed my purse down carefully, taking in the details around me with a clarity that felt almost detached. The candles had already been lit. The plates were set. The wine glasses were filled halfway, as if the evening had already begun before I arrived. My seat was still there, tucked neatly between Linda and Daniel, as though nothing had changed at all. That, more than anything, felt deliberate. "You are just in time," Linda said, her voice light, almost cheerful, as if she were hosting a perfectly ordinary dinner. I nodded once, meeting her eyes for only a second before looking away. I did not trust myself to hold her gaze any longer than that. Not because I was afraid of breaking, but because I did not want to give her the satisfaction of seeing anything in me she could interpret as weakness. I sat down slowly, smoothing the fabric of my skirt, and folded my hands in my lap. The room began to breathe again after that, conversations restarting in fragments, laughter returning in careful, measured bursts. It was all so controlled, so carefully maintained, that it almost felt unreal. Daniel tried to speak to me once, his voice quieter than usual, asking if I was feeling all right. I turned to him, offering a small, polite smile, the same one I had used for years in situations that required grace instead of honesty. "I am perfectly fine," I said, and I meant it in a way he would not understand. Because something inside me had already shifted past the point of pain. The shock had settled into something steadier, something far more useful. As the evening continued, I listened more than I spoke. I noticed the way Linda touched his arm too often, the way Daniel avoided looking at me directly, the way certain guests exchanged glances they thought I did not see. Every detail, every small gesture, began to arrange itself into a pattern that was no longer confusing. It was clear, painfully clear. They had not just made a decision. They had built a moment. They had planned this reveal, chosen this setting, invited these people, and expected me to stand in the center of it without disrupting their version of events. I let them have that illusion. I even raised my glass when someone suggested a toast, the crystal cool against my fingers as I lifted it just slightly, enough to appear present, enough to play my role. But inside, I was no longer reacting. I was observing, measuring, waiting. Because for the first time in a very long time, I was not thinking about how to fix what had been broken. I was thinking about what it would look like when the truth finally spoke for itself. The rest of the evening unfolded exactly the way they wanted it to, and that was precisely why I said so little. I let Linda lead the conversation, her voice rising and falling with an ease that suggested she had rehearsed every word long before I stepped into that room. She spoke about new beginnings, about unexpected blessings, about how life sometimes takes you in directions you never saw coming. People nodded. Some even smiled as if they were witnessing something hopeful instead of something carefully constructed on the remains of what had been mine. Daniel added just enough to support her, his tone measured, his words chosen with care, as if he believed restraint would make this all appear more respectable. I noticed how he avoided specifics, how he spoke in general terms about timing and clarity, never once addressing me directly in any meaningful way. It was not guilt that guided him. It was calculation. And Linda, she filled in the silence he left behind, always ready, always poised, as if she had been waiting for this moment far longer than I could have imagined. I listened, quietly, letting their version of events settle into the air while I traced the edges of the truth underneath it. Because once you stop reacting, you begin to see things more clearly than you ever have before. Every glance they exchanged, every pause that lingered just a second too long, every polite laugh from the guests who did not know where to look or how to respond. It all told a story they had not intended to reveal so openly. At one point, Linda reached for my hand across the table, her fingers light, almost gentle, as if she were offering comfort instead of delivering betrayal. I looked down at her hand resting over mine, and then back up at her face, studying it the way one studies something unfamiliar, something that used to be known but no longer made sense. "I hope you understand," she said softly, her voice lowering just enough to make it seem sincere. I held her gaze for a moment, long enough for her smile to falter at the edges, long enough for her to realize that whatever she expected from me was not coming. Then I gave her the smallest nod, a gesture so controlled it could mean anything or nothing at all. Understanding, after all, does not always mean acceptance. The dinner continued, plates being passed, wine being poured, conversations weaving in and out of safe, neutral topics. But beneath it all, there was a tension that no one could fully ignore. It sat just under the surface, pressing quietly against every word spoken, every movement made. I could feel it in the way the room never quite relaxed again, no matter how hard they tried to pretend otherwise. I excused myself once, stepping away from the table and into the hallway where the air felt cooler, clearer. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to stand still, my hand resting against the wall, my reflection staring back at me from a framed mirror that had hung there for years. I looked exactly the same as I had that morning. The same face, the same eyes, But something inside me had rearranged itself entirely. I was no longer standing inside the life I thought I was building. I was standing just outside of it, looking in. And from that distance, everything appeared sharper, more defined, almost inevitable. When I returned to the table, nothing had changed on the surface. Linda was still speaking. Daniel was still nodding. The guests were still playing their parts. But I was no longer part of that arrangement. Not in the way they assumed. Because while they believed they had already revealed everything that mattered, they had overlooked one simple truth. They had only shown me what they wanted me to see. And now, I was ready to see everything else. When the dinner finally ended, no one asked me to stay longer, and no one offered to walk me out, which told me more than any words could have. I picked up my purse, thanked Linda for hosting in the same calm tone I had used all evening, and stepped outside into the cool night air where everything felt quieter, more honest. The drive home took 23 minutes, the same route I had taken dozens of times before, but that night it felt unfamiliar, as if every streetlight and stop sign had shifted just slightly out of place. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, not allowing myself to replay the scene I had just witnessed, not yet. Because I knew once I started pulling at those threads, everything would begin to unravel all at once. Instead, I focused on what I already knew. Not what they had shown me, but what I had chosen not to see for far too long. The first time Daniel canceled dinner without explanation. The way Linda had insisted on being present during conversations that had nothing to do with her. The subtle change in tone when my name came up in their discussions, as if I had slowly become an outsider in my own life without ever being informed. At the time, I had dismissed each moment as harmless, as coincidence, as something not worth questioning. That is what you do when you trust people. You give them the benefit of the doubt, even when the doubt begins to grow heavier than the trust itself. When I pulled into my driveway, the house was exactly as I had left it that morning, quiet, orderly, untouched. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of polished wood and lavender greeting me in a way that felt almost grounding. This was still mine. This space. This life I had built over decades. No one had taken that from me, no matter what they believed. I set my keys down on the small table by the door and walked slowly through each room, not out of habit, but out of intention. The living room, where Daniel had once sat across from me, speaking about plans and promises that now felt distant and hollow. The kitchen, where Linda had stood beside me countless times, laughing over things that seemed genuine in the moment. Each memory rose quietly, not to overwhelm me, but to clarify something I had not allowed myself to fully understand until now. They had not changed overnight. They had revealed what had always been there, hidden beneath familiarity and routine. I stopped in front of the closet where my dress should have been, the empty space inside confirming what I had already seen with my own eyes. For a brief moment, I let my hand rest against the doorframe, feeling the absence as something tangible, something real. Then I closed the door gently, not out of sadness, but out of finality, because that dress was never just fabric. It was a symbol of trust, of belief, of something I had offered freely and without hesitation. And now, it belonged to a version of my life that no longer existed. I moved to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, the simple action steadying me in a way nothing else could. The clock on the wall read 9:47, a time that would have once meant very little, but now marked the exact moment everything had shifted. I sat at the table, the same table where I had spent countless evenings planning a future that had quietly been rewritten without my knowledge. But this time, I was not planning. I was thinking. Carefully. Deliberately. Because for the first time since all of this began, I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was deciding what would happen next. And that difference, small as it may seem, was everything. The house remained quiet long after I turned off the lights, but I did not go to bed right away. Sleep felt unnecessary, almost irrelevant, compared to the clarity that had settled over me. Instead, I stayed at the table, the same place where I had spent years making plans that now no longer belonged to me, and I began to do something I had not done in a very long time. I started to look at everything without emotion, not as a sister, not as a fiancé, but as someone standing outside the story, examining it piece by piece. The first thing I reached for was my phone, not to call anyone, not to confront them, but to review messages, dates, small exchanges that once felt ordinary. I scrolled slowly, my thumb moving with purpose, not urgency. There it was. Conversations that had seemed harmless at the time now carried a different weight. Linda asking questions that were too specific, too detailed for someone who claimed she only wanted to help. Daniel responding at odd hours, sometimes delayed, sometimes overly brief, as if he were dividing his attention between two conversations I had never known existed. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. I did not feel anger as I read. That surprised me at first. I had expected something sharper, something that would rise quickly and demand action. But what I felt instead was a kind of stillness, the kind that comes when confusion finally dissolves into understanding. And understanding, I realized, is far more dangerous than anger, because it does not rush. It does not cloud judgment. It waits. I set the phone down and leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the pieces settle into place. This had not been spontaneous. It had not been a moment of weakness or a sudden change of heart. It had been built over time, carefully, deliberately, in ways that required patience and coordination. Which meant one simple thing. They had underestimated me completely. They believed I would react, that I would cry, or argue, or demand explanations that would allow them to justify what they had done. They expected me to play the role they had assigned to me, but I had already stepped out of it. I stood up and walked to the small desk in the corner of the room, opening the drawer where I kept documents that most people rarely think about until it is too late. Financial papers, property records, agreements that had been signed with trust but written with precision. Daniel had never been careless, not in the practical sense. He liked things organized, predictable, structured. It was one of the reasons I had trusted him. But structure, I had learned over the years, can work both ways. I pulled out a folder and placed it on the desk, flipping it open with steady hands. Everything was exactly where I had left it. Names, dates, signatures, details that, until now, had simply been part of building a shared future. I traced one line with my finger, reading it again slowly, making sure there was no room for misinterpretation. There was not. I closed the folder and let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. This was no longer about what they had taken. It was about what they believed they had secured. And that difference mattered. Because while they were celebrating something they thought was theirs, they had overlooked the fact that not everything transfers as easily as appearances might suggest. I returned to the table and sat down once more, the quiet around me no longer empty, but filled with a sense of direction. I did not need to rush. Time, I realized, was no longer working against me. It was working with me. They had chosen their moment. Now, I would choose mine. And when it came, it would not be loud or dramatic or chaotic. It would be precise. It would be undeniable. And most importantly, it would be something they could not undo. The next morning arrived quietly, as if nothing in the world had shifted, as if the previous evening had been nothing more than an ordinary gathering that had ended without consequence. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window in the same soft way it always had, casting familiar patterns across the table where I had sat for hours the night before. I made coffee the way I always did, measuring each scoop carefully, pouring the water slowly, allowing the routine to settle into my hands and steady my thoughts. Routine has a way of restoring order, even when everything else has been rearranged. I did not check my phone right away. I knew there would be messages waiting. Questions, perhaps. Explanations carefully worded to sound reasonable. Or worse, silence that pretended nothing unusual had happened at all. Instead, I carried my cup to the living room and sat in the same chair where I had once listened to Daniel talk about future plans, about shared time, about building something lasting. The memory no longer carried weight. It sat there like an object I no longer needed, something I could observe without attachment. When I finally reached for my phone, I did so without hesitation. 3 messages from Linda, 2 from Daniel. I opened Linda's first. Her words were soft, almost concerned, asking if I had made it home safely, if I was feeling all right, if we could talk. The second message followed the same tone, adding that she hoped I understood how complicated everything had been, how difficult it was for her to find the right moment to tell me. The third message was shorter, more direct, asking me not to shut her out. I read each one carefully, not for what they said, but for what they avoided. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had truly been done, only explanations designed to protect her position, to maintain control over how the situation would be interpreted. Daniel's messages were different, but not in the way he might have intended. His words were measured, restrained, as if he were trying to remain composed even in text. He said he wanted to explain that things had changed over time, that he never meant to hurt me. I paused on that sentence for a moment, reading it again, not because it confused me, but because it clarified something important. Intent, I realized, had very little to do with outcome. Whether or not he meant to hurt me did not change the fact that he had. And more importantly, it did not change what he had chosen to do after that realization. I set the phone down without responding to either of them. Silence, in this moment, was not avoidance. It was control. It denied them the reaction they were expecting, the opportunity to guide the conversation in a direction that favored them. I stood and walked back to the kitchen, rinsing my cup and placing it carefully in the sink. Every movement felt deliberate, purposeful, as if I were re-establishing ownership over the smallest details of my day. Because that was where it began. Not with confrontation, not with explanation, but with control. Later that morning, I dressed with the same care I would have given to any important day, choosing a simple outfit, something neutral, something that did not draw attention but did not diminish me either. I looked at myself in the mirror for a moment, not searching for reassurance, but confirming something I already knew. I was still here, unchanged in the ways that mattered. Whatever had shifted around me had not altered that. Before leaving the house, I returned once more to the desk where the folder rested. I opened it again, reviewing the documents with the same steady focus as the night before. Each line remained clear, each detail unchanged. That was the advantage of things written with precision. They do not adjust themselves to fit new narratives. They remain exactly as they were intended. I closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer, this time with a sense of certainty that had not been there before. Because now, I was no longer preparing to understand what had happened. I was preparing for what would happen next. And somewhere between the quiet of that morning and the stillness I carried within me, I realized something that would guide every step forward. They believed they had already crossed the finish line. They believed the story had reached its conclusion. But what they had mistaken for an ending was simply the point where I began to write my own. By mid-afternoon, the quiet of the morning had settled into something more structured, something closer to intention than reflection. I did not rush through the day. I moved through it with the same measured pace, allowing each decision to follow the next without hesitation. Around 3:15, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen before answering, already knowing who it would be. Linda. I let it ring twice more before picking up, not to create distance, but to establish it. Margaret, she said, her voice carrying a softness that felt carefully placed. I have been trying to reach you. I could hear the tension beneath her tone, the slight tightening that comes when someone is no longer certain how much control they have over a situation. I saw your messages. I replied evenly, keeping my voice steady, almost neutral. There was a brief pause on the other end, as if she had expected something else, something more emotional, something easier to respond to. Can we talk? She asked. In person. I considered the request for a moment, not because I needed time to decide, but because I wanted the silence to settle between us. Silence has a way of revealing more than words ever can. Yes, I said finally. We can talk. She exhaled softly, relief slipping through despite her effort to maintain composure. Tonight? She asked. Around 6. I looked at the clock on the wall. 3:17. Enough time. That works, I said, and ended the call before she could add anything else. I set the phone down and remained still for a moment, letting the shape of the next few hours form clearly in my mind. This was not a confrontation, not in the way she expected. It was a continuation, a step forward in a process that had already begun the moment I chose not to react. At 5:45, I arrived at the small restaurant Linda had chosen, a place we had visited countless times over the years. Familiar, comfortable, predictable. The kind of setting where difficult conversations are often softened by routine. She was already there when I walked in, seated near the window, her posture upright, her hands folded neatly on the table. She stood as soon as she saw me, offering a tentative smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Thank you for coming, she said. I nodded once, taking my seat across from her without hesitation. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The waiter approached, asked if we wanted anything to drink. Linda ordered a glass of white wine. I asked for water. Simple. Clear. The kind of choice that leaves no room for distraction. When we were alone again, she leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting into something more earnest. I know this is not how you expected things to happen, she began, her voice careful, each word placed with intention. But you have to understand, it was not planned like this. I watched her as she spoke, not interrupting, not reacting, allowing her to build her explanation piece by piece. She spoke about feelings that developed over time, about confusion, about not wanting to hurt me. The same pattern, repeated in different forms. Justifications wrapped in concern. I let her finish. Then I leaned back slightly, folding my hands together in front of me, mirroring the calm she was trying so hard to project. You are right, I said quietly. I did not expect it. She nodded quickly, as if agreement would bring us closer to resolution. But I continued before she could speak again. What I expected, I added, was honesty. That word settled between us, heavier than anything she had said. Her expression shifted, just slightly, enough to reveal the uncertainty she had been trying to keep hidden. Margaret, she started, but I raised my hand gently, not to silence her, but to pause her. You do not need to explain, I said. Not today. She looked at me then, really looked, as if trying to understand what I was doing, what direction this conversation was taking. Because this was not how she had imagined it. There was no accusation, no raised voice, no demand for answers, only something quieter, something she could not easily navigate. Then why are we here? She asked, her voice softer now, less certain. I met her gaze, holding it just long enough for the meaning to settle before I spoke. Because, I said, some conversations are not about what has already happened. I paused, letting the silence do its work. They are about what comes next. And in that moment, I saw it. The realization. Not complete, not fully formed, but enough to unsettle her. Enough to make her understand that whatever she thought she had secured the night before was not as certain as it seemed. Linda did not respond right away, and for the first time since I had arrived, she looked unsure of where the conversation was going. Her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass, the faint clink of it against the table, the only sound between us for a moment. What do you mean? She asked finally, her voice quieter now, stripped of the careful confidence she had been holding on to. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I reached into my purse and placed a single envelope on the table between us. It was plain, unmarked, the kind of envelope that does not draw attention to itself, which made it all the more effective. Linda's eyes dropped to it, then back to me, searching for some kind of explanation I had not yet given. You said things were complicated, I began calmly. And you are right. They are. Just not in the way you think. She hesitated before reaching for the envelope, her movements slower now, more cautious. When she opened it, her expression did not change all at once. It shifted gradually, the way understanding often does, moving from confusion to recognition to something much harder to conceal. I watched her carefully, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because this moment was not about watching her react. It was about making sure she understood. What is this? She asked, though the answer was already forming in her mind. It is a copy, I said evenly. The original is filed properly. She looked down again, scanning the page more quickly now, her breathing just slightly uneven. Margaret, she said, her voice tightening, why are you showing me this? I folded my hands together on the table, maintaining the same steady posture I had carried since the conversation began. Because you should know exactly what you are stepping into, I replied. And more importantly, what you are not. She looked up at me then, really looked, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the calculation beneath it. Daniel knows about this? She asked. There it was. Not concern. Not regret. Strategy. I held her gaze without blinking. He signed it, I said simply. The silence that followed was different from the others we had shared. It was heavier, more grounded in reality than in assumption. Linda leaned back slightly in her chair, the paper still in her hand, her thoughts moving quickly behind her eyes. I could see it in the way her posture shifted, the way her confidence no longer sat as comfortably as it had before. This does not change anything, she said after a moment, though her voice lacked the certainty it had carried earlier. I allowed a small pause before responding, just enough to let her words settle in the space between us. You are right, I said. It does not change what you have done. I let that sit for a moment before continuing. But it changes what happens next. Her grip on the paper tightened slightly, the edges bending under the pressure. "You think this gives you control?" she asked, her tone sharper now, defensive in a way she had not shown before. I shook my head slowly, not in disagreement, but in clarification. "No," I said. "Control is not something I am trying to take." I leaned forward just slightly, enough to close the distance without raising my voice. "It is something I already have." That was when it truly settled in. Not just the words, but the meaning behind them. Linda's expression shifted again, this time more visibly. The certainty she had been holding on to finally giving way to something else entirely. Not panic. Not yet. But awareness. The kind that comes when a situation no longer follows the path you expected. I sat back again, returning to the calm stillness that had guided me from the beginning. "You made your choice," I said quietly. "Now I will make mine." And for the first time since the evening before, there was no illusion left in the room. Only the quiet understanding that whatever they believed they had gained came with terms they had never taken the time to read. I did not wait for her to respond. I did not need to. The moment had already settled into place, and anything she said after that would only be an attempt to recover ground she had already lost. I reached for my purse, standing slowly, not in a hurry, not with any sense of urgency, but with a calm finality that did not invite interruption. Linda remained seated, the paper still in her hand, her eyes fixed on it as if reading it again might somehow change what it meant. It would not. Things written with clarity rarely do. "Margaret," she said, her voice lower now, stripped of the careful tone she had used before, "we can figure this out." I paused just long enough to acknowledge that she had spoken, but not long enough to suggest I was considering what she had said. "You already have," I replied quietly. I did not look back at her as I turned toward the door. The restaurant felt different as I walked through it, the familiar space now carrying a new kind of distance. Conversations continued around me. Glasses clinked softly, plates were cleared, and yet none of it felt connected to me anymore. That was the thing about moments like this. They separate you from what used to feel normal, placing you somewhere just outside of it, where everything becomes clearer, sharper, more defined. When I stepped outside, the evening air felt cooler than it had earlier, the sky just beginning to darken as the last of the daylight faded. I walked to my car without hesitation, unlocking it with the same steady movement, and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. Not because I needed time to think, but because I understood that this was the exact point where everything shifted from what had been done to me into what I had chosen to do in response. The drive home was quiet, uninterrupted, the road stretching ahead in a way that felt almost symbolic, though I did not dwell on it. I had spent enough time reflecting. Now, I was moving forward. When I pulled into my driveway, the house stood exactly as it always had, unchanged, steady, waiting. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a soft click that echoed just slightly in the quiet. I placed my keys on the table and walked through the space once more, not searching for anything, but confirming something that had already settled in my mind. This was still mine. Not because of ownership on paper, though that mattered, but because it had been built with intention, with time, with a kind of care that cannot be replaced or transferred simply by decision. I moved to the desk and opened the drawer, taking out the folder once. Again, holding it in my hands for a moment before setting it back exactly where it belonged. I did not need to review it again. I already knew what it contained. What mattered now was not what was written, but what would be done with it. I turned off the lights one by one, moving through the house with a sense of completion rather than loss. In the bedroom, I paused briefly, looking at the empty space where plans had once existed, plans that no longer held any meaning. There was no bitterness in that realization, only clarity, because what had been taken from me was never what truly defined me, and what remained was something they had never understood well enough to consider. I lay down, the room quiet around me, and for the first time since everything had unfolded, I allowed myself to close my eyes without replaying a single moment. There was nothing left to question, nothing left to figure out. They had made their choices. I had made mine. And somewhere between the silence of that room and the steady rhythm of my own breath, I understood something that would remain long after all of this was over. They thought they had taken my future. What they actually did was return it to me, free of anything that no longer belonged. And that, more than anything else, was something they would never be able to take back.